All right, everyone, it's a little bit past 1 p.m., so I think we'll go ahead and make a start. First of all, I wanted to welcome all of you. My name is Peter Mandeville. I'm the director of the Ali Verlach Center for Global Islamic Studies here at George Mason University. And on behalf of myself and our director of research, Professor Hussein Yilmaz, I wanted to welcome you all to this presentation by Professor Andrea Stanton of the University of Denver on lived Islam and COVID-19, the digital turn 6 months in. As some of you know, here at the center, we've been running since mid-June a webinar series that features scholars in the broad field of Islamic studies whose work is starting to look at some of the questions at the intersection of public health, and more specifically the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on Muslim religiosity from a variety of perspectives and across a wide range of geographic and national settings. For those of you who would like to have more information on the series, I'm going to go ahead and throw up in the chat room a link to the entire roster of sessions, both the ones we've had in the past. And if you go ahead and hit that click that link, you'll see that we have them now programmed all the way through until December with a lot of really interesting sessions coming up. If you are interested in this topic and have missed some of our previous sessions, I also wanted to make sure that you're aware that the previous sessions have all been recorded and are available to you from our center's Vimeo site. And I've just thrown up a link in the chat room to that site as well. So I am really delighted today to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Andrea Stanton from the University of Denver. In order to kind of maximize the time that we have with her, rather than reading out her extensive and impressive bio, I'm going to put a link to it in the chat box as well, so you can click on that and learn more about her. Dr. Stanton is an associate professor of religious studies and also chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Denver. She is a friend of our center. We had the good fortune to be able to work with her a few years back on a National Endowment for Humanities sponsored initiative, a summer institute focused on teaching connected histories through the Mediterranean. And so for that reason, it's a particular pleasure to welcome her back. She is the author of this very fine book that I would recommend to all of you. This is Jerusalem Calling, State Radio and Mandate Palestine. And I'm also going to throw up a link to that book it's published by University of Texas Press, and there's a link to it. Among other things in the book, she presents a really interesting analysis of how the British Mandate authorities essentially acted as religious actors in terms of shaping the content, the religious content broadcast on the Palestine Broadcasting Service during the mandate period, a kind of early example of, and this is why it's of interest to me, of what I've been looking at in recent work in terms of the geopolitics of religious soft power. So today's session is essentially a part of a double header that we've had over the last 2 weeks. Our previous speaker in the series was Dr. Gary Bunt, who, as many of you know, has done a lot of work kind of looking at the intersection of the internet, online and virtual culture, and Islam. And with her presentation today, Dr. Stanton will kind of give us another take on that same issue. She'll be speaking to us for 30, maybe 40 minutes or so, and then we'll turn over to you, the audience, for question and answer. And there'll be a variety of ways that you'll be able to kind of pose questions in the chat box using the Zoom raise hand feature. talk a little bit more about that when Professor Stanton is finished speaking. I would just ask that you please make sure to keep yourselves muted until we enter the Q&A and discussion period. I also wanted to introduce my colleague, Aisha Norsonmez-Goma from the Center for Global Studies here, who's here helping to support the webinar series. There she is, and you may be hearing from her as we go along. So Dr. Stanton, without further ado, welcome, and we'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such a great series. I'm really honored to be part of it. And now that I've caught up with almost all the previous talks, I'm also more than a little bit odd to be able to spend some time in this space. So we'll see how it goes. Oops, shoot, this is not working. Oh, well, you're going to start out by seeing a big preview of this whole thing. Okay, we're going to go back to the beginning. So I was originally scheduled to give this webinar over the summer. And so I realized when I was starting to prepare for it this fall, using my notes from then, just how important it is to recognize that for many people, many organizations, many institutions, we're in a different moment than the moment or moments that characterize, let's say, July, and that those moments are also different than the moment or moments of March and April. So I want to start by acknowledging and highlighting that this pandemic era has its own history and its own experiential timeline. So that's kind of my bias as a historian. I always go back to the temporality. And for me, it's also a little bit similar to how our pandemic experiences are differentially formed by our positionality. So how each of us, we's, have experienced the lockdown, have experienced economic dislocation or anxiety, have experienced the calls for racial justice, have experienced political environments in the United States and overseas that have been polarized or toxic during this period, and how we have managed or coped with family members, friends, students, others getting sick with COVID-19. And so all of these experiences, as we know, are informed by our being in bodies that are raced and gendered and sexed, classed, familied, that inhabit particular national, regional, and local political, social, economic, and religious or spiritual contexts. So all of those differentiated experiences might be kind of laid over a temporal chart, suggesting that March and April are different from May, that May is different for many folks from June and July, and that August and September have been a new set of moments, especially for people whose positionalities are also affected by the academic calendar. So I want to recognize and name that this temporal movement is happening and that it impacts all these other experiences. This slide has one of many similar charts showing what's called the emotional life cycle of a disaster. I don't think it actually really maps well onto the COVID-19 pandemic because it suggests that the disaster happens in one moment, kind of like a hurricane, whereas I think we might think of the pandemic chart as one where smaller disasters, rises in positivity rates and outbreaks at a local or state level, loss of a family member or a friend at an individual level, kind of continue throughout the peak and the fall and this long slog of coming to terms and starting to build out a new normal. And of course, and to go back to my earlier point, it also wouldn't be just one chart, even if the temporality better fit a pandemic model, because the threats are different for people in different positionalities, as Dr. Austin and Dr. Mu'min Rashad reminded us, for example, for Black and Brown Americans in terms of likelihood of getting sick with COVID or the greater vulnerabilities for worse health outcomes. So the honeymoon period, which I'm going to talk about a bit here, was also differently experienced by positionality, as Dr. Mir reminded us, in terms of American Muslim women's experiences of exclusion around Ramadan ritual practices and the overall debate over whether participation in ritual activities by screen is acceptable, and how that debate maybe overlooks what women in some communities have been doing in terms of participation for years. And similarly, the griefs and the terms that people are coming to are also different. So somewhere also in the disillusionment and the long slog of working or coming, we also see structures of authority working to reassert control over practices that had been disrupted or being broken open in new ways. And so Dr. Mir highlighted some examples of this. So did Dr. McLaughlin in terms of Saudi authorities and their Hajj management and messaging. And so did Dr. Bunt in terms of contemporary Muslim influencers working to reassert or assert authority. So I want to recognize that this chart doesn't fully capture much of the complexity of lived experience, looking at it both in terms of Muslim lived experiences and also looking at it in terms of academic lived experiences. But I want to hold on to the idea that temporality matters and that stages matter, and that many of the we's brought together in this webinar series have been experiencing this long slog for the past few months. I also want to highlight, let's see, I lost my cursor. There it is. Okay, I also want to highlight that in addition to thinking about temporality, I have some kind of framing questions that kind of shape some of my thinking. I'm not going to try to answer them all. Partly, I'm not sure that some of them have answers yet. Others, I'm not sure have definitive answers. But I'm putting them up just to kind of show where I'm coming from, and also in case any of them resonate with this kind of community of participants today is something we might talk about later. So in the spirit of kind of a UDL approach, I will read them out in case anyone's on the phone or, I don't know, folding laundry while you're doing this, whatever else you might be managing in your lives at this moment. So one question I'm interested in is the one I just talked about, the kind of the roles of temporality and stage in lived experiences and in analyses as Muslims and or academics of this pandemic. I'm also very interested in this question of what can be productively taken forward into the new normal that emerges. So what is it that is broken open in terms of practices, collaborations, norms, behaviors, and how might authoritative voices or structures support them? For a while I had rather than undermine them there, and then I decided that was too negative, so I took it out, but they're in my head. I'm also interested in thinking about how we might understand kind of current and future efforts as a continuum rather than as a binary of either online or offline, since that's not really how we live, and that's not how really many of us have lived for some time. And so what kind of ways might we suggest for building and sustaining community through a kind of mixture of online and offline activities, engagements? And then I think a really critical question is also about the kinds of inclusions and exclusions that both current and future efforts lead to. And so how might the inclusions be amplified and how might the exclusions be mitigated to support equity? So again, I'm not going to answer all those questions, but those are kind of some of the ones at the back of my mind. I also want to acknowledge again that all of this is shot through with positionality. This is an update. If you're looking at it, this is a dog managing a laptop and a couple of desktops, and it says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. It's an update of an old New Yorker cartoon. And so I just want to highlight some of the positionality, or that there are positionality issues in digital research. And so I think that's particularly important. Well, I think it's particularly important in all cases, and for the purposes of this webinar series, really important given the richness of the conversations in this series, and also the very wide variety of positions and approaches among presenters and kind of participants, which in the ones that I've seen is ranged from kind of very explicitly internal to very explicitly external. So just to give you a very brief, without boring you, contextualization of my positionality, I'm at a secular institution. The University of Denver is a secular institution. I'm not personally religious. I am a tenured faculty member and chair of the Department of Religious Studies, and our department motto is "Religion Matters." We take religion seriously. We're at an institution with a teacher-scholar model with a focus on students and research. I am born and identify as female and heterosexual. I'm white, I'm Euro-American by race or ethnicity. I'm also a born US citizen. And so my family's history of immigration is pretty far back in the past. And that's also, I think, an important contextual point. I'm personally from the Midwest. I grew up in Iowa. I have roots on the East Coast and the West Coast, and I live in Denver. A place that I never really knew before I moved here, but I like quite a lot. It's really lovely. I'm a mom. I have 6-year-old twins, and for most of the time I'm a single parent. So that also impacts a lot of how I think about everything in life, professional and personal. And I am a historian of the Middle East by training, as Peter noted. So I am actually later this week focusing on the radio side of what I do. So I like to think of my work there as trying to bring sexy back to radio by showing what an important role that radio had as a really exciting medium of the 1930s and 1940s. And for me, that's the thread that connects my work in more digital spaces in the contemporary era. If you don't find that convincing, I will tell you my undergrads also find that pretty unconvincing as well. both the excitement of radio and the idea that I'm really competent in the areas that they consider themselves digital natives. In any case, the research isn't about me in the sense that it's not focused on me, but I think it's important to recognize that we are always in our research, both as individuals and also as kind of a constellation of contexts and backgrounds of privileges and biases. So let's kind of get into the mix. I want to take us back very briefly, just as an example of what I'm calling the emergency moment of March. This was a moment, I think, that, as we may recall, there was really no playbook. There was little knowledge. There were lots of efforts in all kinds of directions, political, health, economic, and otherwise. But in many ways, it was a very depositional and depositionalizing moment within a set of assumptions that everybody in affected communities, or at least for the United States, in affected states, was facing the same level of threat and risk. I'm not suggesting that's accurate, but I'm just kind of highlighting that as a reminder of where we, or the various we's, were. I'm using as an example, I'm trying to bring in some Colorado examples here. So this is the Muslim Students Association from our downtown connection of a couple different institutions. We call it the Auraria campus. It's the big MSA in the Denver area, as my the MSA students at DU at my institution would say. I'm going to focus on the US in my examples today with a couple of Canadian additions that have made their way in there. There are really great arguments for taking a global or a regional perspective. I'm just going to focus on the United States because, one, the health situation has been so distinctly dire, and so too has been so distinctly politicized, and because these have really intersected in ways, these have intersected with American Muslim communities in ways that I think are particularly useful to reflect on, given the kind of vibrant, diverse nature of American Muslim communities, as well as the fact that these are communities that have been under pressure for almost a full generation. So that's the March moment. And then what I want to talk about is kind of the first stage of what I think of as crisis effervescence. So this is a little bit of a call out to Durkheim, which reminds me of my college days, Religion 101, which in principle, that would be collective effervescence. But I'm not sure that we had either the feelings of unity or group solidarity, at least in the United States in the spring. So let's just focus on effervescence, a kind of maybe contagious euphoria around doing heroic tasks or around doing more than what had been done, whether that would be in a less explicitly religious context, homeschooling, or let's say buying toilet paper. So let's talk about that really briefly. What I'm just gonna say here, I wanna just, if you're looking at the images, while you take a look at the images, let me just throw up 3 caveats. The first is that what I'm going to talk about here probably won't be new for many of you, whether that's not new from a research perspective or from a lived experience perspective. However, I find value in putting these observations together. I've decided that I am an organizer in life. I am not an innovator. And so I'm trying to organize these different observations so that we can kind of see what we get when we put them all together. I also want to say, number 2, I'm looking at a pretty high level. So I'm looking at the fact of these events happening rather than the kind of granular experience of being in them, of participating in them. And I think that's important to recognize, again, from a positionality perspective, that some of these events that I'm showcasing may indeed have been joyous and affirming for some folks, and for others, they may also have been spaces of exclusion and marginalization. So I just want to kind of hold space for that and recognize that images and the fact of events are not the full story. And then finally, the third point caveat I want to make is that some of what I'm highlighting, of course, is not specific to Muslims or Islam. And I think that that's also important. I'm going to say, as somebody who teaches at a PWI in the United States, where most of my students do not identify as Muslim and know little about Islam, sometimes simply saying that, yes, these phenomenons are not unique to non-Muslims and are also not unique to Muslims, is itself doing some important work. So what I'm going to highlight here is that in this kind of moment of what I'm suggesting as effervescence, we see this kind of celebratory focus on connectivity, on virtual gathering. Also, a lot of efforts to put prayer and other ritual elements online, as Dr. Mir discussed. Those actually tended, in terms of what I've seen, to be less celebratory, at least in terms of kind of iconography or graphic design. And my impression is also that those, the more kind of ritual focused, prayer focused events have tended to happen more on platforms like Facebook Live, while iftars and other community focused, participant focused events tend to happen on Zoom. Every so often, like you'll see, there's an example here of Microsoft Teams. Not personally my favorite platform for getting everybody together, but another effort. So I don't want to make too much of the platform differences, but I want to note them. And I also want to note that the use of multiple platforms has also meant that many people are indeed not doing one-stop shopping for religious, spiritual, or community needs. So even if folks are going through the same institution at the platform level, people have been encouraged to make multiple stops. And so again, focusing towards this question of what might break open for the future, that I think may facilitate multi-platform, multi-stop engagement for the future as well. The second one, again, I both love and have so much to say analytically about some of these images, but here again, we see a mixture of effervescence and community building, embracing COVID social practices. So in this case, in the MAPS virtual and drive-through Eid celebration, kind of embracing the idea of a decorated car parade as part of a religious event. We also see a mixture of national organizations, national institution events, and local ones. And we also see efforts to build ties beyond geography. And so the little Canadian edition that snuck in there at the top left, because I like it so much, is coast to coast Eid celebrations. And so we see this kind of sense of connecting across space, doing so virtually. And of course, we also see some issues of race and ethnicity in some of the depictions of at least the family and the little car that's doing the drive-through parade. So I'm happy to come back to any of these while we have time to chat later, but for the purposes now, let me just say this is just a sampler, and what I just want to highlight is that these are really celebratory, they're community focused, and the big one, the MAPS virtual and drive-through is also kind of a blend of in-person and online, and so again, I think that's something that we want to kind of think about for the future. So celebratory, community focused, online and offline in some cases, building connections beyond geography, and having certain ideas about who's in the community kind of replicated visually in some of the imagery. Okay, I also, so the imagery on the previous slides was really creative, and I certainly don't want to diminish or take away from that. But I also just wanted to note that one of the things I think we saw this spring was the proliferation of new or repurposed COVID-specific, Islam and Muslim-specific stock images and virtual backgrounds. And so what I'm taking from this, to put it in really technical terms, was that it was enough of a thing that a kind of digital support infrastructure was emerging. And so I'm just putting up a sample here, and they each have their own limitations and challenges. So the top one, the mother, father, and child having dinner in person while laptop chatting with somebody's parents is called in the description is called iftar with elders. No, sorry, virtual iftar. Virtual iftar dinner with family elders during Ramadan. And so we may have various questions about that. I think my first, again, to put it in really technical terms, is what is with that meal, both in terms of the fact that I feel like this is kind of a regular, like there's three things, four items in the meal, fine. But also there's no spoon for the bowl of whatever is in the middle of the table. There's no cutlery for the salad. This could be an interesting meal for folks to eat. My guess is that this particular image was repurposed and was renamed as an iftar, but I think that's actually analytically interesting as well. Again, the men with masks who are hugging, so great that you are wearing masks. Also not maybe so great that you are hugging from a public health perspective. Also, again, I don't see a lot of major ethnic or racial variations. It's one image. And then the virtual background is really beautiful. That was a Zoom background. It's also referencing, I think, a very particular geographic and cultural experience of Ramadan, which may not look like a lot of Ramadan in the the US context. So I was trying to think this through and was kind of settled on maybe it's the equivalent of putting up flocked Christmas trees in Florida, or singing I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas for folks who don't live in Christmas areas. And then I'm kind of a sucker for all sheep related Eid things. I think it's very, very American to celebrate the animal getting slaughtered for a holiday and to make it the iconic referent for the holiday. Americans do this for Thanksgiving, for example. I'm not super wild about putting masks on animals, but I think it's a very interesting so, okay, so, all right, so let's, I see there's some stuff happening in the chat. Yes, okay, but I think maybe it's not for me. Okay, all right, so, oops, I just wanna now kind of switch over, and for the rest of my time speaking before we chat is to just point out some trends I'm noticing, and then hopefully this might spark a discussion about trends that others are noticing, and how they either connect with what I'm highlighting here or they correct what I'm highlighting here. I think both could be equally possible. So I started with a slide that said recommendations because I really liked Dr. Rashad's recommendation section. Then I decided I wasn't really in a position to recommend things. I went with suggestions. That seemed still too much. I went with observations. That sounded annoying. And so I just, I landed finally on the productively vague and positionally ambiguous things. And so I just want to note, I'm asking us in general to be attentive to temporality, but it's also pretty messy up close. So what I'm going to cover next includes some examples from the late spring and early summer. It doesn't map on perfectly to my temporal argument. So the first one I want to talk about is what I'm calling generally wraparound activities. And so I think this actually also responds both in part to the platform diversification that I was mentioning earlier, as well as what Dr. Mir mentioned in her talk as the pragmatic eclecticism that at least some American Muslims have adopted in terms of looking for meaningful spiritual engagement and religious community engagement. So going from organization to organization or initiative to initiative and filling kind of different buckets of need at each. And I think we see here both how the pandemic situation might facilitate folks who are Muslims' ability to go from site to site, virtual site to site in this case, in order to fill those buckets, and how it also might push various mosque organizations and other Muslim organizations to offer out wraparound activities to fill those buckets with the stamp of those organizations. So we see both kind of ground up or local efforts and also kind of efforts to create authoritative activities and spaces. So, and again, I just want to highlight that people are being encouraged to do this on a structural level because of the various platforms that are operating. And that is kind of reinforced or has been reinforced this spring and summer by the ways in which folks with kids who are in school have also been operating on multiple platforms for their school. Folks who've been working from home have been operating on multiple platforms. Folks who have, I don't know, family and friends they want to stay connected with have also been operating on multiple platforms. So this is in many ways kind of a multi-platform moment. And I think I see some real potential for thinking that through as a trend that will continue. So in the wraparound category, I'm putting kind of examples of religiously based community engagement that go beyond ritual activity. So basically anything that might fit into a bigger picture of religious learning, community building. So kind of picking up on lived religious identity and kind of taking it like what other aspects of one's life might that encompass. We might also add in here efforts at interreligious engagement. I've seen quite a bit of that online. I'm not totally sure what to do with it, so I didn't really include it in here, but I'll just call it out. And so here on the left, there's a lot of Texas organizations online, as it turns out. Maybe that's just a Colorado thing, because we also have a lot of visitors from Texas who come through frequently. But at any rate, so Humans of the Islamic Association of Allen on the left with kind of video features. And then also on the right, I just put the Islamic Center at NYU's kind of fall programming. Again, I want to highlight that it's not that this stuff couldn't happen before the pandemic, and it's not that some of it might not also have been happening before the pandemic, but I think what we're seeing here is some different ideas about online and offline community, online and offline engagement that may kind of come in as a blended form for the future. The second thing to watch is the organizations or groups that are not simply moving ritual and really kind of explicitly religiously related activities online, but are focusing broader online programming on community needs. So I'm seeing this as kind of a subset of the wraparound activities, but it has a slightly different nuance. So here, for example, this is a case study from a Seattle area 12-er Shia community. And I think of this in the context of what I've seen for advice to nonprofits, which is that you don't want to just be asking people for money all the time. You also want to be kind of the go-to place for information and learning on the bigger picture of that issue. And so what I see here, the kind of equivalent is you don't want to be just the place where people go for online prayers, but you also want to be the place where people go to learn all kinds of things. And so I just put in two examples on the left. These are totally out of order chronologically, sorry about that. On the left, we have kind of a survivor testimony of somebody who did not expect to get COVID and did. And then on the right, we have best practices for remote learning for kids from May. So neither of those is explicitly connected to religious learning or religious community, but both of them are helping reinforce that this is the community you go to when you want to learn things about that are relevant to the rest of your life. Okay. And then the third one is connecting across distance. Again, I feel like this is very obvious, but it's worth saying. And so here I just put up also, I guess these are my 12-er Shia slides. So I put up two examples. One is from a Colorado community listing various Eid prayers from live streamed Eid prayers from around the United States, from New Jersey, Maryland, other places. And then the other one is from the Ahlul Bayt Muslim community of Colorado, kind of highlighting an event that a Salt Lake City community was doing to live stream in from Muharram. So what I just want to highlight here, again, all of this was possible before the pandemic, but there's been an impetus to kind of take advantage and maybe suggest to members of one community the ways in which this community is part of a larger collective. So that might be stronger for folks who participate in some of these events, but from a passive programming perspective, it's also impacting those who don't participate in the events but simply know about it. And so I just want to throw that up also as a way of both passive and active kind of connections across geography, which is different from a pre-pandemic idea of sending somebody around as a guest speaker or doing like some kind of conference, right? These are kind of lower stakes, kind of ongoing options that might be something to watch for the future. The fourth one, I only have 6, so I promise I'm almost done if you're getting tired of sitting, and then we can chat. The fourth one is about well-being and mental and emotional support. I think that's something that is a trend to watch. Again, not specific to Muslims, not specific to religious communities, really important for everybody these days, also really important before the pandemic. But what I see, I have seen personally I think that I personally have seen this coming out more over the summer. There probably were earlier efforts, so I don't want to say that this is only something that has been happening in the past couple of months. But again, just putting up a couple different examples here. Fall programming from the Princeton University Muslim community around kind of peaceful meditation, Black Muslim talk space, and then kind of an August event on response training for Muslim mental health. So again, there's nothing that has to be specific about the pandemic for this. There's nothing that has to be specific to Muslims, Islam, religious folks in general, but this I think is a trend to watch. And then the fifth, of course, is racial justice. Lots and lots of events, as I think we know, focused around, I think, doing the kind of emotional and educative labor of explaining racism and anti-Black racism specifically, and also lots of events focused on Black Muslims. Many of those that I have seen have been outward facing. And so I just want to pick up on some of what I think Dr. Austin's and Dr. Mu'min Rashad's key points were in terms of just offering a small sampler of internally facing events. I would also note that there are actually a number of events still online from February during Black History Month. So there's a bit of a potentially sustained conversation between February and June. But here we have, again, just 3 examples, all speaking more or less to a set of internal communities, although certainly publicly available. So whether that community is defined as Shiite Muslim, women Muslim, Colorado Muslims, they're very different in their approach to the medium and the audience. Again, just looking at this very small sampler. The Imam Hussein event, which is available on YouTube, is a little over 2 hours. The Colorado Imam Council event was advertised as 45 minutes, although it actually ran about 70, if I remember correctly. And I think what was interesting, it was on Facebook Live. And so again, not to drag you all into my obsession with platform differences, but one of the things that's interesting about Facebook Live videos versus YouTube videos is you can kind of see the timestamps, and the comments come up as you're watching, or at least for me, the comments come up as I'm watching in terms of the moments when they appeared. And so you kind of get more of a sense of the conversation as it was happening. And then finally, I just wanted to end my last point, this kind of what I'm calling difficult dialogues, on a thread from some of the earlier talks, talking about the ways in which some to many American mosques approached reopening, which was to welcome back adult male worshipers while excluding women and children. And so here I just want to suggest that some older platforms for online engagement in some particular contexts might provide some interesting space for productive, difficult dialogues around these issues of women's access and equity, as well as other potential spaces for of difficult dialogue. So I'm just going to end with a case study. So the case study I want to highlight here is that of the Colorado Muslim Society, which, as I think some of you may know, is the largest mosque in Colorado. It's one of the relatively few purpose-built mosques in Colorado. It's kind of a flagship mosque, or if you want to bring in an old newspaper analogy, it's kind of a mosque of record. It's Sunni in orientation. It has a very wide range of worshipers in terms of ethnic diversity, racial diversity, country of origin diversity. It's also the place anecdotally that other mosques often send converts to, in terms of, because it offers more support and is seen as more kind of welcoming and educative. It's also the place where politicians come. So this is where, like, the big multi-faith gatherings, this is the place where people come whenever there's a hate crime or there's any kind of major Islamophobic incident, either in Colorado or elsewhere. This is where people come. This is where the governor's representatives come. This is where the state representatives come. This is also where the police and the sheriff's offices come and give talks. And this is also the place that the local media come to first. So on the left, I just want to highlight, we see the entrance regulations for the first Jama prayer after the stay-at-home order for Colorado was lifted. So this was for the first week of June. And then on the right, we see the revised guidelines for the second week of June. There's actually a lot of things that are different between these two. So partly there's just a really interesting learning process, I think, happening. The June 11th sign, for example, says explicitly that CMS is following the governor and the Colorado State Health Department guidelines, gives the website for those, it gives the name and the contact information, which I'm sorry, I had to kind of cut it off the slide, but it gives the name of the CMS spokeswoman, it gives the name of the office manager, and it gives a phone number to call with questions or comments. It gives the Facebook page as the space to watch for future updates, and it provides information on how to donate. So it's also very American in that sense. So the second one is filling in a lot of gaps, but for our purpose, the key change is what I highlighted with my kind of little scribbled notation, from women and children not permitted to children 12 years and under are not permitted. And the imagery also changed as well, right? So from a woman with a boy and a girl child to 2 boy children. They are still delightfully happy despite being excluded. And they're still also not particularly racially diverse, but those are kind of the key changes. So again, I just want to highlight, this is a case study and not an exemplar, but I just put just a couple of snippets from the conversation that followed on Facebook after CMS announced its reopening plans. And so what I want to highlight here is the way that this old social media platform, and I'm using the word old because my students have told me that Facebook is for old people, which I find really irritating. I'm like, I'm on Facebook. any rate, that this is an older social media platform, and yet it's one that has allowed for a more substantive dialogue between community members and CMS staff or representatives. And so if we were going to go through the entire conversation, we'd see that it involved about 20 different people, including folks who seem to identify as men and as women, as converts and as born Muslims, and as people of different racial, ethnic, and potentially country of origin backgrounds. And I think what we see here also is that within a week, CMS announced this change in policy that supported proportionately equitable access for women. So I want to just use this again as a case study, not as an exemplar, and not as something that diminishes or obviates the challenges of communities elsewhere or the intra-community challenges. But I want to just kind of hold space here for the potential for particular communities, particular organizations, also those perhaps interacting on specific kinds of online platforms to have these kind of semi-public community conversations that can be catalysts for greater equity. And at the same time, I also want to, again, acknowledge that this conversation and others like it would have been less accessible to community members who aren't comfortable in English, who don't have reliable access to a reasonably fast internet connection so they can hang out on Facebook, or aren't comfortable engaging in such a public space. Okay, so just in passing in the end, one thing I've tried to do today is kind of highlight some of the back and forth nature of ground up community member driven or community member led activities, and those that are more controlled by mosques or other managed by mosques or other religious organizations. That's in part because I think we've heard quite a bit really great thoughts about religious authorities from some of the earlier talks in this series, and we also have one coming up next. And so I just kind of wanted to raise up some other areas of engagements for participants to consider. But just in closing, there are two areas that I think are really rich and also deserve more careful consideration. So the one is du'as around sickness and healing, including those specifically for COVID-19. So I just put up one particular example of this. It's a YouTube video with the speaker, and then also some examples of prayers. And then also you see here, so what are some standard recommendations, and also what are some specifically religious or spiritual recommendations. And then I also wanted to highlight that I think there's another area for research, which is digital engagements around parenting and children's education in this moment. This is where the mom came out. Like I don't think I can do it because I just started looking at all the summer camps as a mom and not as a researcher, but I think there's been some really interesting efforts around that area. And I think that would be another place to look in terms of areas for future research and also areas to walk. So, or areas to watch. So I will close there and say thank you so much for listening for the last 37 minutes. And I really look forward to the conversation and the time that we have left. I'm going to turn off the screen share and get back to a community-focused Zoom.
Great, wonderful. Andrea, thank you so much. In addition to sharing the examples, the cases, the themes that are emerging in your own work, I really appreciated how conscientiously you kind of built on and referenced some of the insights and contributions that previous speakers in the series have shared. I think really helped to kind of summarize and advance the work of the series, as a set of interrelated talks that are kind of trying to take, those of us who want to see this as a emerging community of scholarship around these topics to help us move forward. So I really, really appreciated that. I have all kinds of stuff that I'd love to ask you, but folks have heard from me. They've heard amazing stuff from you. And so I want to open the floor to our participants now. If you'd like to join the conversation, raise some questions or just enter the discussion. Several ways you can do that. On the main control, if you have the participant window open on Zoom, you'll see that there's the option to raise your hand. You can do that and I can call on you. You could just jot down in the chat box that you'd like to ask a question. If you prefer not to ask the question out loud, you can put your question in the chat box and I will read it out. And also, if you feel comfortable doing so, please do feel free to turn your video on. We actually run these as Zoom meetings rather than Zoom webinars in order to try to produce something of a feeling of being together in a room where we can see each other and have that sense of community that we, are often so craving these days. So please feel free to turn your video on. We only ask that you keep your mics muted when you're not speaking. So floor is open. Raise your hand, jump in the chat box if you'd like to get into the conversation. If I could start, Andrea, just by asking you, you know, in the opening framing questions, you made, I think, this very intriguing point that when we talk about online and offline, we tend to speak about it in terms of an almost fundamental rupture, right? That there is offline in real life, you know, IRL stuff, and then there's online virtual stuff. And you make the point that like that rather, you know, is it maybe not more accurate to consider this as something more akin to a continuum? And that human experience, particularly as online and virtual activity comes to be integrated and present in so many more dimensions of our life, that it just doesn't really make sense to think in those dichotomous terms anymore. And I just wanted to ask if there were any sort of particular ways in which that observation of a continuum rather than a rupture seems to you to be particularly relevant with respect to the intersection between the pandemic and Muslim religiosity.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I should say I am not the one who, I'm certainly not the only person who has noted that this is a continuum and not a rupture. So I don't want to suggest that this was like a new thought that I am bringing to the world. When I look back at kind of earlier discussions of this, like I can find discussions of basically continuum versus rupture, maybe going back like to 2012, 2014. And some of those, at least the ones I've seen, tend to look or suggest that there's kind of reality, and then the continuum brings this augmented reality or super reality. And I just, it doesn't totally work for me. And maybe it's kind of a historicization on its own that, and this just is reality, but I don't want to say that there's a total seamlessness between online and offline, but I think for many people, there is more of it, right? Like it is not less real for me to be with you all right now than it would be to be with you in person. It'd be interesting if you all popped out of the screen and joined me in person right now. That would be surprising and augmented, but the experience is not. And I think, again, for those of us who are also academics, like at least for many of my colleagues, even before the pandemic, we were not all online all the time, but we sent emails. That is actually online. We had students submit assignments via Canvas, let's say. That is also online. I mean, there's ways in which some of the stuff that we do online now, we don't actually even realize is online anymore, right? Like when you send a text, that is often online. So, and so I think, for me, in terms of specifically getting to your question about intersections of pandemic and Muslim religiosity, I'm not sure that there's anything specific to Islam, Muslims, religious folk that this continuum hits. It's more, I'm just trying to argue that we need to kind of recognize the way in which we live. Like our language needs to catch up with how we live, and therefore our lived experience and our analytical efforts also need to catch up with that. And some of our planning for human engagement towards the future also, in my personal view, also needs to catch up with that. So I think that's, I'm trying to kind of have a way for us to recognize where we actually are and where many of us have been for some time, but then also think about that in the conversation with equity and access, and inclusion and exclusion, which again, like I don't think I have a particularly great definitive answer, or maybe it's an answer that's also emergent, but I think it's something that we want to pay careful attention to and not make the error of being too celebratory that this is a new era that is breaking open and it's going to be great for everyone. New eras are almost never great for everyone.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got a question from Lauren Osborne. So Lauren, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, it was funny you were saying that. I'm just getting ready for my online class here on Zoom. So I'm curious, given that you work on radio, you kept remarking about the differences in media platforms and how that is interesting and significant. And I think it is too, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts on like why that matters, and if there's anything you've observed about kind of the specifics with respect to how platform fits here.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hi, it's good to see you also. So I think I am a little platform obsessed, and I'm not actually a great technology person. So I'm obsessed without having any skills to really clarify this from like a technical perspective. But I think that one of the things, I'm also not a huge fan of the word affordances, which I don't think I use very well, which is partly, I think, why I'm not a huge fan of it. But I think there is something about some of the platforms, and maybe this is more specific to the pandemic, some of the platforms, so platforms channel people to behave in particular ways, right? They have particular things that they allow us to do, and they have things that they encourage us to do, and they have things that they absolutely don't allow us to do, and they have things that they discourage us from doing. And so I think that, and I think that we actually mostly recognize that intuitively, again, as we inhabit different platforms, right? So like I can text up to X number of people, but I can't ever bridge everybody and, and do a major emergency notification because I don't have that authority or capacity. And I think that I'm particularly thinking about these days about, let's say, Zoom versus Facebook versus, let's say, FaceTime, and the different kinds of relationality that those allow or encourage or don't allow or discourage, and also the ways that Facebook was designed for humans in relatively disorganized small scale groups. And then Facebook Live has kind of come ground up from individual people basically using it as like a version of Periscope, that old platform, the technology that's kind of gone, and now is used for more formal occasions, whereas Zoom is a business platform, right? And so those of us who are academics use it and kind of push it to do different things, let's say using breakout rooms to get undergrads to talk, or using it as a way, you know, so, or using polls to gain engagement or different things. But so you can get platforms to do things other than what they were originally designed for, but they still do encourage or discourage. And even as Peter was saying, that this is set up as a meeting rather than a webinar, right? Like a webinar just tells you, okay, I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to say much. There might be an anonymous Q&A. On the plus side, I can have my camera off and nobody knows that I'm actually lounging on my bed right now. So there's pluses and minuses for the way that we're living, but I don't think that platforms determine how people act, but I do think that they are influencers. And I also want to be clear, I don't think that the organizer of a particular event says, I am absolutely going to choose Facebook or Teams or Zoom because I absolutely want to have this kind of control. I think it's partly also, oh, I've used Teams before. Oh, I've used Zoom before. Oh, everybody seems to be on Zoom. I'll use Zoom, right? So there's all kinds of different factors that go into the choice of a platform. What I'm just trying to suggest is that, like, both that we pay more attention to the ways that platforms channel people, and also that I do think that folks who are online in religious and non-religious community and individual contexts are already operating across multiple platforms, probably without full realization of doing that. And that I think of this as something that will be a kind of a long haul continuation.
Great, thank you, Andrea. So we're turning now to someone whose own presentation in this series you referenced a few times in your talk, and that's Shabana Mir.
Hi.
Hi, Andrea. That was wonderful, and I learned so much. And I'm taking notes as I listen. So this was
notes from yours.
Oh, I'm very grateful for that. I really appreciate that. You know, the women's scholarship, uplifting each other. I really like that. So I'm going to be that dude who has a comment and a question. So, because somebody's got to do it. I mean, I just
you only have a comment, actually.
No, I got to do that because we're talking about like Muslim events and stuff. So there's got to be that. I have to represent that that role. So so you were talking about what can we carry forward, and I really have been thinking about that and what. Because this has been a difficult time. The pandemic has been a difficult time, but it's also been a very, I feel like in many ways, a productive time in terms of thinking about alternative possibilities. So I was thinking, sorry, I'm going too fast for you. I was thinking about ways in which we accommodate people, and you mentioned this briefly, people of different social class and abilities to access certain locations, right, by car, etc., versus people who can access digital spaces. And the other thing was accessibility for people with disabilities. So as somebody who really struggles, particularly in Ramadan, to make it to events because of like health issues, you know, you make it to like a tarawih and then you can't wake up for suhoor afterwards. So it's like, it's a real struggle for a lot of people with disabilities, and that became kind of an issue as well. The other thing that I was thinking about that you raised was well-being, a focus on well-being, which really emerged because the pandemic has everybody so distraught and collectively distraught and upset and depressed and struggling, that we were in many ways people who never acknowledged feelings have been forced to acknowledge them in a community space. So would you like to say a little bit about that?
Yes, so thank you. That's a brilliant comment, and I really appreciate your comment. And it also makes me recognize that I actually totally failed to and totally overlooked to address questions of ability, disability, disenfranchisement by society in person and societies in person and online by physical and other disabilities. And so I apologize for that. That was a glaring omission on my part. And I think I think going back to what I said earlier, I don't think that new eras generally are good for everybody anyway. And so I think that the questions of equity and access around folks who are considered disabled by various societal definitions is something that we, all the we's in this digital room, need to consider going forward. And so I think that could be helpful. And I'm not going to try and go away from disability here. And yet I also recognize that there are ways in which digital engagement supports folks with different kinds of abilities, folks with different kinds of, let's say, caregiving commitments, folks with different kinds of sustainability commitments, right? So and I think about this with colleagues who also for various reasons have challenges, let's say driving to locations, or that there's an economy of time factor. There's also an economy of energy factor. There's an economy of family commitment factors. And so I think there are ways to be cognizant of these issues and to build them in so that online and offline as a continuum can support greater equity and inclusion. Again, this isn't specific to Muslims, Islam, American Muslims, religious folk. I mean, this is a human problem, right? This is a human failing. So I think there's space for that. And yet I think given my own blindness to it, that I also think that my own lack of attention to this, that's also terrible that I just said that, that I think that it's something that will need to be very carefully foregrounded so that it's part of the thinking and the planning for the future. And then the second point that you raised about the distress and the struggling, I really appreciated in your talk, for those of you who recall Dr. Amir's talk, I think you started off by talking about grief and that this is a time of grief, right? That there is a grief for all kinds of lost normals, even the normals that were inequitable, right? There is a grief for loss. And so that resonated with me very much also in thinking about well-being. I think that it might be worth kind of breaking down the question or the idea of a collective, right? Collective distress, collective struggle. I think that as in many moments, I mean, what I was trying to say about the March moment, at least for the United States, was that it was very depositionalizing, but it was not accurately so, that it was suggesting that all people in affected areas were affected to the same degree and in the same way by health threats, economic threats, political threats, and others. And that was not accurate. It wasn't true. And I think it actually produced a lot of setbacks in terms of conversations in the United States about the pandemic. Again, not specific only to Muslims, but so intercommunity, and I think that collectiveness, also collective distress, collective struggling, also needs to be carefully broken down, or at least analyzed, to think about who is suffering, how is that suffering manifest, how is that suffering recognized and valorized, and how is that suffering less recognized or given less space for acknowledgement. So.
Okay, Andrea, we're going to turn to Laura Jones in a moment for the last question, but I also wanted to draw your attention to a question that Gary Bunt actually jotted in the chat box, where he, given that Facebook is for old fogies like us, have you noticed any kind of differences with respect to, innovative uses of technology on other platforms like TikTok and Instagram? And in the interest of time, Laura, I think we'll just go straight to you now, and then maybe Andrea can answer both questions in a final round.
Okay, my question was basically about, you titled your talk the kind of digital turn in terms of Muslims and COVID. So it's just about how much were these kind of digital methods and digital events and digital things, how much were they happening already, and how much was COVID kind of producing them or changing them?
That is a great question. Thank you very much. So I don't have a full quantitative analysis, so let me give you my impressionistic one, which is that online events, including online events at kind of building senses of community through a particularly focused event, I find ones archived online that go back at least to 2017, so go back at least 3 years. And so I think that what you're asking is really important, right? And so I think that what we see, and again, this is not specific exclusively to Islam, Muslims, American folk, religious folk, but what we see is that there was already a foundation, right? Like there were already things that were happening. So I know of communities where khutbahs were already delivered through Facebook Live. Not clear how many people were watching them, but that kind of thing was happening. There were already webinars, right? So I mentioned some about Black Muslims that I saw from February, but I also saw some about Muslim parenting, let's say, going back several years. And so I think that this is also actually true of social history as well, that very rarely do we have cases in which folks all of a sudden on day one realize that, oh, we can do this whole other thing, and we have all these new social practices that build up around it. And so I think what we see in the case of the pandemic is that there was a foundation of having Facebook pages ready to go, of having different kind of platforms where there was something already there, so that it was not a learning curve from zero for everybody in the community. Certainly it was a learning curve from zero for some people in some communities, but it was not from zero. And so I think that I really appreciate, I don't actually love the phrase digital turn, it's just one that's used. And so I kind of wanted to continue that conversation and also put it a little bit into question. And so I think your question really highlights that further, right? So the pandemic has pushed many communities, has encouraged and pushed many communities to go much further into the world of online ritual, prayer, community engagement, and others, but it didn't come from nothing for many communities. And for those that it did, I think that's where maybe we see more challenges. And then to go to Dr. Bunt's question, I'm gonna have to end with a confession here. I don't use TikTok. I'm not fun and creative, and I don't do music videos in my spare time. And so I've seen lots of great examples, but I regret to say that I have not been a participant. And so I would hypothesize that yes, there probably is, but I would also hypothesize that at least in terms of mosque communities and larger national organizations, that I think that the building out of platforms, including TikTok, well, who knows what's going to happen now in the United States, but assuming that folks can still access TikTok and or will just ignore the regulations or learn how to get around them if they, depending on what the US regulations around TikTok end up shaping out as, I would suggest that the building out of presences and then activities on platforms like TikTok is one that comes later and that targets particular like youth communities. Instagram does that a little bit, but we have seen events, particularly, I guess, going back to your talk, of individual folks who've really kind of inhabited Instagram and made that as the place to go and see them and hear them. But I think that the goal of events like putting ritual activities, prayers, Eid celebrations online, and the goal of large community engagement is to stay with the platforms that more people are already familiar with, right? So that the potential for user error and the potential for user frustration and the potential for then user disaffection and disengagement is lower. And so that would be what I would kind of hypothesize would be the kind of the big platforms that as many people as possible are already using or already familiar with are the ones that get the first cut at the events and the community engagement. And then there's more space for kind of niche ones further out.
Great, wonderful. Well, folks, we are at time. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And I think really kind of helping to frame some of the kind of key themes and questions that a lot of us who are kind of trying to feel our way through this question of how not just the pandemic, but kind of new modalities and spaces of community engagement, you know, as shaped by the ongoing pandemic. I think you've really helped us to kind of think through some of the kind of cross-cutting issues and themes that we need to bear in mind as we continue doing this work. As you yourself mentioned, we have as the next speaker in the series, someone who's going to be, I think, probably picking up on some of the themes that you've introduced. So I've just put up in the chat room now details of our next talk in the series. It's Professor Marcia Hermanson from Loyola University of Chicago, who will be speaking on October 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern on American Muslim negotiations of authority in the time of coronavirus. And we've also got a link there now, so you can just go ahead and RSVP and register right now if you want. If you really can't get enough of these sessions, I also wanted to let you know that our next online webinar hosted by our center, it's not part of this particular series, it's just part of our regular fall semester series of guest talks, is actually happening tomorrow. And it happens to have a sort of medical health dimension to it. This is Dr. Shireen Hamdi of University of California, Irvine, speaking on her book, Our Bodies Belong to God, Organ Transplants, Islam, and the Struggle for Human Dignity in Egypt. And that'll be tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. And I think Aisha has just put up details of that talk in the chat box as well. So it just remains for me to thank Andrea, to thank our guest speaker again for sharing with us today, and to thank all of you for joining us as well. Hope to see you again at another of our events soon. Take care, everyone, and stay well.